Excellent. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to get the ROI from SharePoint. It's a tricky one because a lot of it is soft benefits, but we're also going to be talking about the hard benefits and some considerations around what you need to budget. So by today is Ben. Ben, you lead our consulting team. Thank you for joining us. Who is today for Ben, and what are they going to walk away with?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rupert. So yeah, so today this is really for anyone who is perhaps a business leader, IT manager, or say IT director within the organization, and you're questioning, is SharePoint the right answer, and how do you start assessing whether or not it is worth making the investment into SharePoint to get yourself up and running. So we're going to spend some time looking at the pros and cons of taking a SharePoint-based approach, and really, how do you make that assessment on whether or not it's going to pay off, and potentially where it doesn't.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I think it's fair to say SharePoint is not the answer to all the world's problems. But one of the things that I do see over and over again, and is that there's a lot of great, should we say, point solutions out there, and we've got them on the left of this screen, where Microsoft has comparable solutions, but maybe they're not quite at the same level. We know some people like, we love Notion, Loop. Yeah, it's getting there, but it's not Notion. Why should we move? What's your take on that?
So yeah, I mean, I use this in workshops. I kind of make this point quite a lot, which is that Microsoft does 80% of a lot of things. So if you were to compare like for like in each case, I'm sure that the point solution will do 100% and have a fuller feature set than what Microsoft is offering. But I think the key point is that Microsoft does 80% of all of those things, as opposed to having to invest in each and every one of those products that doesn't natively talk to another product.
Yeah, and then I guess there's the other bit, which is you need to glue them all together, don't you? So we've got one tool here, Zapier, which does it. Does Microsoft need that glue then?
Well, it doesn't, because you've got the advantage of everything being on that one platform. So again, when I'm in my workshops and I'm explaining to people how, Microsoft Teams is very closely related to SharePoint and OneDrive, and if you've got your files in one place, you've got access to them from all of these other products as well. Whereas, again, taking these point SaaS solutions, you're going to be investing quite a lot of technical complexity, or using a tool such as Zapier or another middleware to stick them all together.
Yeah, and I think the one that I'm seeing right now, which is really changing this, which is Microsoft Copilot. So if you have a Copilot license, the screen comes up and you can type in, look, I'm looking for a file, or I'm looking for an email, which I sent to Ben. It references, a webinar, and we're talking about intranets, for example. You've suddenly got this enterprise search, but in a natural language form, which I'm seeing, great value. And I think it's one of the bits of Copilot which is really helping me find what I'm looking for quickly. But let's take this a bit further. Let's dive into, I think, one of the most difficult ones to measure ROI, which is intranets. Now, internet space, very competitive, lot of solutions out there. I think, many times when we start projects, many people are using an alternative tool for SharePoint intranet. It might not be the reason we get invited in to speak to a client, but often that conversation does come around then. So where do you start when you're thinking, should I be using SharePoint for my intranet? Should I be using another platform? Should I stick with what I've got? Do I even need an intranet?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the key thing really is, before you can assess the sort of business case, you have to have a clear understanding of what your intranet is going to be for. What is the purpose of your intranet? So we've done a webinar on this in the past, where we go into a bit more detail. But we're just going to summarize those two key points, which is that the intranet is doing two key things. One is engagement, and the other is productivity. So let's take a look at engagement. We're talking about news, employee feedback, supporting collaborative conversations, promoting and aligning the brand, the values, mission, strategy, and things like, promoting employee events. And often this is something that's going to be driven by perhaps an internal comms team in a larger organization, or maybe in a smaller organization, it might be driven from a marketing team typically. So it's going to be very news and content, news and content heavy. But on the other side, we've got productivity, which is around, people being able to access that definitive version of something. I've got the definitive version of a policy. I'm not confused or having to go and ask lots of different people because I don't know what the right version is. So it's that single source of truth, signposting those key resources so people don't have to go around looking for them, and tied together with a sort of intuitive search experience, ultimately so that you can reduce the time it takes to do something.
Yeah, so it sounds like that productivity side is about self-service with confidence. I find something, I know where to find it, and when I found it, I can rely on it. On the engagement side, it's more about what's going on in our business. Why should I be excited about that? This is something I want to be a part of. But that engagement stuff, very hard. How do you turn that from something, which feels good to, as you call it, Ben, a key success indicator?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think when we're looking at, the business case of an intranet, one of the key things we really need to understand is what are we going to measure and what are we expecting to improve as a result of this intranet? Because ultimately that is going to be the thing that warrants the investment in it. So what we're looking to do is find some quantitative key success indicators that we can use and baseline and assess at a later date. And the one that we've got up at the moment, for example, is reducing the number of tickets or queries that might be raised to a HR, IT, design, marketing team, etc. So if people are regularly going to the HR mailbox and asking questions that could easily be served up by having some content in the intranet, so people don't need to keep asking, that reduces the resource impact on those teams, so they can focus on doing other work.
Okay, that's an interesting one. And I think the other element of that particular one is the role that AI is now beginning to play. So
Yeah.
someone searching for vacation used the term holiday, and therefore, standard search wouldn't find it, but AI will because it's got the same underlying meaning. Talk to me a bit about Net Promoter Score and why this might be important.
Yeah, so this is very much an engagement focused key success indicator. So ultimately, when we think about engagement and we think why do we care about employee engagement? Well, the reality is people that are engaged and feel happy in the organization, they're going to work harder, they're going to go the extra mile for the organization, and probably most importantly, they're less likely to leave. So you're going to ultimately be able to reduce your staff turnover. Now, we're not going to say that staff turnover is something that you're going to be able to directly attribute to your intranet, because there'll be other factors involved. However, using a baseline, an industry standard tool such as Net Promoter Scores to capture feedback and assess whether or not people would recommend you as an organization to their friends, family, etc., is a good way of starting to assess that. So as I say, we're not trying to imply that the intranet is going to directly increase this, but ultimately what we're looking for is some quantitative measures that will help us assess the engagement in the organization.
Okay. Now, a bit more, I should say, on the formal side. So compliance of policies, Ben.
Yes, I mean the key thing here is if people are compliant, or more people are compliant to policies because it is easier to access them and people are clear and they understand where to find them, then that is going to reduce your risk in an organization. So reducing risk will have an obvious a quantitative benefit, a tangible benefit. But again, not necessarily one that you're going to put a number on in terms of your intranet. But if you can measure compliance of policies through having that content readily accessible, then that is going to contribute to that reduction in risk.
Yeah, I think an example I've seen internally here is someone said, look, I know you normally need a week's notice to take a day off, but I was wondering if I could get tomorrow off. And you're just starting that conversation from the right place, which is, rather than the other way around, feeling maybe shortchanged if you didn't get the day off, right? So
Yeah.
having an understanding of those policies, easy to find, just makes life a little bit easier and also reduces that risk of that non-conformance. And then new starters, but
Yeah, I mean, I often will say that one of your primary audiences of a given intranet is the new starters. Those new starters that have just joined and they want to feel connected with that organization and understand its background, its history, its purpose, but then also be able to get access to that key content, those policies, etc. So if you're able to increase their productivity in the respect that it might take them 2 to 3 weeks to get ramped up instead of 2 to 3 months, for example, because they're having to go around and try and find things and find who it is to talk to, and it's not clearly mapped out for them, then that's going to have a net tangible benefit, because they're going to be effective quicker.
I noticed one of the things that we haven't got on this slide is things like likes of news or comments or page views. Is that not a big deal, or is it the one we couldn't fit on?
No, we didn't forget about it. So I've had some interesting conversations with people in the past about this, and people will come in and say, yeah, well, we'll just measure the number of page views of our content. And I would say, that it's a useful tool. So knowing if, say, 80% of your employees are reading a news post that you put out, yes, it might imply, because if only 10% are reading it, then you're not reaching the audience. But I don't really think it's the measure in and of itself, because actually the reason why you do this intranet is to increase or decrease one of these key things. So you really want to increase engagement, but just because people are reading some content, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're engaged. You need to find measures that are measuring their engagement, as opposed to purely the fact that they've read an article, because it maybe appeared in their homepage feed, for instance. It's not quite the same thing.
Yeah, and I think we've all seen it on smartphones, sort of the clickbait news stories, which we've read just because it sounds curious, but actually, does it bring us any closer to that? Not
Yeah.
really. So that's an interesting one. So yes, I understand you can't, if your net promoter score goes up, but no one's actually reading the news, yes, that is a challenge in itself, but we can't tie it directly back to a number of likes and clicks, people. And as this, I guess, it's LinkedIn theory, where 90% of people read and do not interact or comment or anything, 9% comment and react, and only 0.9% actually post content. So maybe that's something similar to an intranet too. Ben, we talked about the, I guess, the investment, the return on investment. Let's talk about the investment itself, and some of the elements that people might need to consider if they're going down the SharePoint route.
Yeah, so ultimately the big investment, if you're going down the SharePoint route for an intranet, is going to be the cost of the services to configure the solution and get you up and running. And those services will align to things like building the company portal, the intranet itself, maybe where customizations need to be applied. That could be on the Power Platform, it could be some developed functionality, moving content from an existing platform into the intranet, whether that's through an automated approach or the service provider such as us doing it, or even the internal staff that need to populate that content. And of course, the training investment that those content authors will need. Now, what we're not saying is that all of your staff will need to be trained for an intranet. Really, you're focusing on those those content authors, because an intranet should be intuitive enough for your end users to be able to go and find what they need without having to be trained on it.
Yeah, you make a good point. You go to any leading news website, you don't get training first, you don't get pop-up helps. It's fairly obvious where to find things, and your internet should be no difference. So
Exactly.
yeah, that gets us up and running, the one-off costs or the project costs. Let's touch on the ongoing costs, Ben.
Yeah, so I mean, that will be things like staff time to update the content, to keep it up to date. So that kind of investment in people's time to create and keep the content relevant and up to date. Inevitably, as content authors might leave the organization, bringing new content authors on so that you're not losing those skills is going to be crucial. Any support that you're going to have to put in internally or your service provider is going to give you in terms of ongoing best practices and support of your SharePoint intranet. And then the final one that really is worth calling out here is any additional licensing. So the thing to bear in mind is if you are an organization that has a number of frontline workers who might historically have not had an email address or a Microsoft 365 license, they will need a license to access the SharePoint intranet. Some of these other platforms take that into account, but SharePoint doesn't. You will need what is referred to as a frontline license, a frontline worker license. Now, that is not necessarily a big cost. Do you want to elaborate on that point, Rupert?
Yeah, I mean, obviously pricing changes by Microsoft, but at the moment to buy a frontline license without Teams and access to SharePoint is going to cost you under $2 per user per month. But it brings additional benefits. So not only will you have access to your intranet, but as it being a SharePoint license, you can access the rest of SharePoint too, so other information and documents. But it also gives you a mailbox. So if you think about how you've been communicating with the staff without a Microsoft license, maybe you're using their personal email addresses, maybe you're posting out pay slips. Very quickly, you've now got a secure place to put that kind of information. Also, you give your employees a secure route to get in contact with those support services, IT, payroll, for example, rather than going through, a personal, maybe Yahoo type account. So I think for the money at that level and the value you're going to get, it becomes, a bit of an easier decision at that price point that Microsoft are coming in at. And so, Ben, I think that leads us onto the flip side. So if we're turning something on, are we potentially turning something off? And maybe I'll just touch on this because I hear about this. So if you do have an existing internet solution, then and it's outside the Microsoft ecosystem, there's going to be some integrations which are in place, probably around identity, maybe some information sharing as well. That's one less thing that you need to manage. There may be costs associated with that. Obviously, we can pull those out as well. And then the other side is the licensing of the platform. Now, one of the things that I see when we look at the financing of a SharePoint project versus a intranet, should we say, subscription type product, is that the return on investment, i.e. turning that off and moving to a SharePoint world, is only about 18 months. Now, that will depend on the organization and what you're investing on your intranet project, on your intranet licensing. But the licensing for those projects are very much OpEx heavy. With SharePoint, it tends to be more CapEx heavy. So there is a balance there, and it's certainly worth crunching the numbers as well as all the other benefits that Ben's talked about as well. But that's only, I guess, one side of what we do with SharePoint. The other big side is document management. And Ben, document management for some people might simply be a replacement for my S drive, but it can be a lot more, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it very much depends on where you're coming from. So if you're coming from a file server environment, then yes, absolutely. You may just be thinking about, I want to be able to manage my documents in the cloud. But the reality is there are a number of different use cases that are worth calling out. So, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but, if we pick up on a couple, so managing contracts, for instance, managing policies that will have a life cycle, that need to be approved and audited periodically as part of an ISO certification, knowledge management, for instance, etc. So I think it very much depends on what is your use case when it comes to document management. Are you looking at getting a standard in for everyone, or are you actually looking at individual departments to look at what they need? And I think similarly to what we were talking about at the start, there will be products out there that do contract management, 100% of what contract management, all of the features. Same thing for policy management, for example. But the reality is with SharePoint, similarly, you're going to get 80%, but you've got this base level platform. And if you've got more than one of these needs, having everything in the same place is going to be really, really valuable.
Yeah, it's that compounding effect, isn't it? That we realize as employees, even if I work in one of these areas, I am going to touch other areas on this chart here, on these examples here. So if somebody brings us in to do, a contract management solution, they want document automation, that kind of thing, it's still going to interface to compliance and risk. So there's some consideration there about when you bring a dedicated solution in. And I think one of the things that you've seen over and over again, Ben, is that people always underestimate the number of licenses they need of that point solution because they forget about the other parties who need to interface with that data.
Yeah, exactly.
And so talking about investment, let's look at the investment on the document management side itself. So big driver in COVID was the ability to modern collaboration. So initially working from anywhere, but working together as well was a side benefit of that. But firstly, it was really, I need to access my documents and I'm not on the company network, I'm working from home. Then people realize actually Microsoft's got some nice interesting tools here where we can both go into the same document at the same time, saying goodbye to that message saying this document is now locked, please notify me. But they were still using, as I call it, full fat words, so the tools that they're used to. So that's modern collaboration. Ben, why don't you talk me through a couple of these others?
Yeah, I will do. So maybe the speed. So, I think one of the advantages here, let's take contract management, for instance. If you're having to generate documents and you're having to turn things out quite quickly, it could be NDAs, it could be contracts, for instance, having a solution that's going to allow you to, auto populate documents so you can send them out for signature, in a matter of minutes as opposed to hours for someone to go and write a document. This ultimately is going to make you much more productive, but also it's going to reduce the likelihood of mistakes as well. So I've had certain customers say to me, and I'm sure you have as well, Rupert, that they were quite impressed that, off the back of a conversation, we immediately had a proposal out to them for Policy Express with the associated NDA, for example, and how quickly we're able to turn that out with all of their appropriate data. So, yeah, that's a key example. The other thing is around findability. So, one of these common challenges we have is we've got documents that are work in progress that we're drafting, etc. How do I actually find the definitive final record that I need without having to rely on sort of fairly obscure and complicated naming conventions, for instance? Do you want to touch on the compliance one?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one. Certainly didn't get this with your file server, but now we know, who's edited the document. We've got automatic version control. We can put through approval processes. So very quickly, we're moving away from a world of where every document had maybe initials underneath it. Documents are emailed around for approval and sign off, and then it was saved in someone's inbox. And this kind of feature is built in. So again, the person who's maybe doing that approval, they've got to simply review the document and click approve rather than try and follow a manual process to evidence that approval itself. So really, meeting the standards. And then there's some, broader benefits. So you may have heard of the term e-discovery, the ability to search for a key term across all my information. So, some interesting use cases here. So what I wanted to do is just actually touch back on that previous point, which is document management. When you think of a solution, and this is, I guess, one of the challenges of when you look at point solutions is if I start with a deal and I'm managing that deal lifecycle in the sales perspective, I'm going to need a contract from the contract team. That's going to be influenced by the compliance team who are going to be following the policies which have been previously drafted and approved. So they're going to need access to that too. Now, once this contract is signed, we'll move into a project. So I'm going to want somewhere where I want to store my project risks, actions, issues, dependencies, as well as any related documents. Project leads us into maybe manufacturing in this case. And then from that manufacturing point, we're going to need to bring in suppliers as well. So suddenly you can see how all these things start talking together. And some people in the organization will need access to more of this information. And as you build what's increasingly called this single customer view. How can I see all this information in relation to one customer? So those point solutions, again, do certain things very well, but again, that's what you're giving up is saying no to actually, I don't want that single customer view. So this is really one of the challenges that we're up against. And then I think completing the story of this is when we talked about the intranet at the top of the talk. And that policy management, that knowledge management, well, that's published information. Where does that sit? That sits with your intranet, along with maybe your news and your engagement side as well. So that productivity side we're bringing to light here. So Ben, this is how it can all come together. But what should we watch out for?
Yeah, I think the key thing around this, we're not going to go into the details of this slide because we've covered it in a couple of previous webinars, but the point that we're trying to highlight here is that if you don't do it properly, then you're going to find, people are storing stuff in the wrong place. There's lots of issues around permissions. There's lots of challenges. And all of this is going to have a negative impact on productivity. So if we think the primary business benefit of moving to SharePoint for document management is an increase in productivity, the danger is if you don't do it properly, you might end up with even a net negative, negative increase or decrease in productivity, should I say. So the key thing really is, and we'll see on the next slide, when we start thinking about your CapEx costs, is you really need to think carefully about not trying to cut corners on saving money in that setup, because the outcome is that you don't actually realize the benefits that you're intending and actually could potentially make things worse.
Well, yeah, you've already teed it up, Ben. So let's move on to those CapEx costs of when we're looking at DMS.
Yeah, so a few here similar to the intranet. So there's the document management system itself, the document management portal. So the right structure, information architecture, setting it up. There'll be any workflow that's going around that, maybe for things like approvals or reminders or that type of thing. A really critical part is going to be the migration of the data from your existing system, whether that's a file share or another system, for instance. And last but not least, and I can't stress the importance of this enough, is making sure that all of your users have been trained. Now, unlike the intranet, where your end users don't need to be trained, when you're moving to SharePoint for document management, all of your users will need to be trained. And the approach that we take this when we're doing these kind of projects is, let's say a given set of departments are going to be migrated on a given weekend. We make sure that all of those users within those departments have been trained within 2 weeks prior to that migration taking place, because it's all very well training people or simply pointing to some online resources or training them months in advance, but they really need to be trained at that point so they can be effective from day one.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting one we're seeing now is when people are looking at document management with maybe a bit more of a microscope, but that data migration is actually coming from SharePoint itself, and they want to do it right second time round.
That's right, yeah.
Now, ongoing costs, Ben, do you want to touch on what some of the things that people might be allowing for in their budgets?
Yeah, so I mean, ongoing staff training and support, those are very similar to the intranet. So as people join or leave the organization, you want to make sure that those new people are also being trained in the same way of that kind of original project scope that you had. Again, the support around that and making sure that people are effective. But if we look at some of the licensing here, and really it does tie very much into this kind of AI advanced features, which is that some of the AI capability, and we're seeing a bit more of a kind of pay-as-you-go offering from Microsoft for some of the advanced capabilities. They're not part of the core product. So you do need to factor that in terms of, are there an additional Microsoft licenses, or maybe it might be a third-party license for something like automatic document generation, where it isn't worth the investment in developing that functionality because there's a product out there that does it. So that's where some of that additional licensing may come in that will need to be taken care of.
Yeah, and then I think there's also the things which maybe sit on the side, things that are not always considered, like the e-signature tools as well.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
what can we offset against this? I think, if we look at where organizations have had a standalone document management system, there's always, most people, or nearly every organization we deal with, certainly of a, mid to large size, they're running email on Exchange, they're using Entra ID or Active Directory. So that integration is one thing that they probably won't need if they're using a common sign-on across all their solutions. Also, one less supplier, one less contract to manage, and associated with that is the licensing cost of that platform as well. And then I think the other key part is information security, Ben, and I'm going to save that to the last slide if that's all right. But overall, considerations again, like a lot of SharePoint projects, a lot of the cost is in the capex, and the opex, comparatively low to the cost of actually getting things right in the first place. So the run costs tend to, really be quite reasonable once you're up and running, particularly if you're seeing Microsoft 365 as effectively a sunk cost. So let's just bring that all together of why, Microsoft often is the answer, even if it's not the perfect answer. So Ben, do you want to highlight a few of these, particularly, maybe all of them, rather the commercial side? I'm happy to pick that one up.
Yeah, fair enough. I think probably the one I'm going to jump to actually straight away is information governance. I think that is probably one of the really key critical things here is that, we're seeing this importance of being able to identify things like personally identifiable data and data that might have a risk to the organization, ensuring we're keeping it only as long as we need to. And the fact that this is an underlying capability that sits across the Microsoft suite and can be applied via Microsoft Purview to SharePoint, Teams, email, and other data sources as well. So it's really these kind of underlying capabilities that apply to all of these products that really adds value. The other point I'll pick up on is application platform. So with the Microsoft Power Platform, what you're finding is a fairly, shall we say, sort of industry defined standard set of skills for being able to deploy solutions and configure them and build workflows and additional applications that mean you can get things up and running much more quickly and not relying on too many niche skills in terms of niche skills resources to maintain these things moving forward. Rupert, do you want to pick up a couple?
Yeah, I think the AI index is something I've already touched on, which is the ability of that Copilot to sit across everything. So you've got this common interface, and also, SharePoint Search gives you huge access to all that information as well as document management. So the search and the ability to retrieve information, particularly in larger, more complicated organizations, is massive. And then user experience. I think this is one which is often missed when is that when you're employing people, when you're bringing, whether it's a graduate, school leaver, somebody from another organization, the chances are they've been using Microsoft tools. And so when you bring them to the organization, their time to value is much shorter because you're not teaching them how to use Office. They know how to use Office. They've probably used SharePoint. And so there's value in that rather than to explain people saying, well, we use this tool for this problem, this tool for that problem. I think, that said, Ben, there's still cases where it makes sense to buy point solutions. Maybe you're in HR and only HR people need to use this application and it sits by itself. That probably makes sense too. But maybe finally, just wrap up on the commercial side, that there's value in the bundle. And like most things at Microsoft, if you want to buy 2 or 3 applications, it makes sense to buy all of them. And interestingly, I just took this screenshot from the Microsoft website. If you're taking out a Microsoft 365 E5 license, you're getting all of this, and there's lots more as well. So there's a huge amount of value. And look, I'm not saying you turn everything on. I don't know many people using Access anymore, but it's all available to you. So it kind of becomes, well, actually, we can probably solve pretty much all of our problems in there in a common interface, backed by, as Ben was talking about, that information governance through Purview. And if things aren't talking exactly how you want it to talk, you've got the Power Platform there. So that's going to join that together, isn't it? Ben, any more closing thoughts?
No, I mean that's I think that covers it really well, Rupert. I think it's I think it hopefully gives people a bit of clarity. I mean, I think, as I say, it's that final closing statement of Microsoft does a lot. It doesn't do anything 100% perfectly, but it gives you an awful lot under one license. And yes, there's always going to be that point solution that does everything. But as soon as those things start adding up, you're creating that longer sort of, overhead of management and licensing, whereas actually Microsoft will give you all of that within this one platform.
Yeah, okay. And so look, to wrap up, if you're looking for help with Intranet, if you're looking for document management help, and it might be that you have these solutions in place already on a Microsoft platform, but they're not yielding the return that you're looking for, that the content's out of date in Intranet, that the document structures aren't working for you, maybe there's a lack of automation in there, which means you can't create new project sites with a click. that's the kind of thing that we can help with. And if you'd like a conversation with myself, just jump on our website. If you book a discovery call, that will link to my calendar and we can have a chat. But otherwise, thank you for your time today. Ben, thank you for your insight and input.
Yeah, no,
And
thanks, Rupert.
look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Good stuff.